Good morning. So as usual, today we are taking up another gate in the Ipyaku Hachi Homyo Mon, the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. As you know, we've been working our way through this text. This is a chunk of text which actually is a quote from another long piece called the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. Somehow it got picked up and put down as the 11th fascicle of the 12th fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. So if it's good enough for Dogen, it's good enough for me. And we've been working our way through these gates. So today we're up to gate 32. To work for the Dharma is a gate of Dharma illumination, for we act in conformity with the Dharma. So there's a lot of Dharma happening there. So let's start with this working for the Dharma and break that down a little bit, because there's actually a lot to talk about there. So when you hear people talking about working for the Dharma, usually they're talking about enabling practice in some way. Does it necessarily mean you have a job in a temple or a Zen center or a Dharma center? Not necessarily, although it can. You look at someone in a robe and you say, well, you know, that's somebody who's working for the Dharma, but that's not the only permutation of this. Anybody can work for the Dharma, no matter really what our life circumstances are, as we'll see as we go along. So the kanji that are translated here, working for the Dharma, really have a feeling of moving toward or aspiring to carry out a vow or carry out an aspiration for the sake of the Dharma, right? So there's some motion towards doing something for the sake of the Dharma. One way to think about working for the Dharma is, well, the Dharma is our boss. You know, we work for somebody. To work for can mean I'm employed or supervised by somebody in an organization. I work for the university, you know, or I work for an accounting firm or something like that. If I work for the Dharma in the sense that the Dharma is my boss, what does that mean? What might that mean? Well, it means we take our direction from our practice, right? We make decisions based on Buddha's teachings. So all of that, of course, comes from living by vow. I see Jeff with a hand up.
Yeah, am I supposed to understand if this is the Dharma with a capital D or not? Does it matter?
It doesn't matter for now. Okay, there's Dharmas that's the Buddha's teachings, and there's Dharma that's the way the world works, and we're going to break it down a little bit, right? So for now, if I'm saying this is, I'm working for the Dharma, I'm working for, I guess it's more in the sense of this is the way the universe is, for the purpose of this particular example, okay?
Thanks.
So working for the Dharma in this case, we can go back to saying this is what it means to live by vow, right? This means we're always walking in the direction of liberating all beings from suffering. So now we're back to this original kanji feeling, right? That there's some aspiration, that we're moving towards some aspiration. So we take our direction from the 4 Bodhisattva vows, which we will chant at the end of this talk, from the precepts, which we talk about here frequently, from the Eightfold Path, which tells us how to move forward on a day-to-day basis. Of course, the Eightfold Path is not linear, but these are 8 things we do in our lives to make our life our practice. So we can look at these things as kind of our set of work assignments, if you want to think about it that way, right? Somehow we've been handed these vows, we've taken these vows, we have precepts to follow, we have things to do on the Eightfold Path. We can kind of look at these things as, well, these are our daily work assignments. So I think it's reassuring to have a purpose, right? Perhaps especially now, to have a reason to get out of bed and a reason to go forward and to know that there is something we can contribute. So, you know, one of the components of spiritual health is that your life has some purpose, that you feel like your life has some meaning. There's a reason that you get up in the morning. So working at the direction of the Dharma, if you want to think about it that way, gives us a solid basis for deciding, what do I do now? What do I do at this time? What do I do in this moment? How do I respond to something? We don't have to wander around without a lifeline. And sometimes it can kind of feel like that, especially in times like these, where we're not necessarily getting up in the morning and going to a workplace. Things are a bit upended. It can feel like we're kind of out there without a lifeline, without some direction. We can always take our direction from this practice and from our vows. So we can always look to the 3 treasures, right? We can always look to our practice. So working for the sake of the Dharma, we can think about for the sake of as for the well-being of, right? If we're working for the sake of beings, we're working for the well-being of everybody. So working for the health and well-being of the Dharma is an interesting thing because the Dharma doesn't die. We can never really say the Dharma is unhealthy. It kind of sets up a contradiction, and it's really an interesting intersection to work with. So on the one hand, spreading the Dharma to people who are looking for it and enabling practice and supporting practice where we can do that for people is important, right? I mean, if people are looking to us for help in their practice, how do I get started? Are there resources for me? Can you show me how to sit? Can you answer my questions? Those things are important. And if we can do those things in a gentle way, in a meaningful, skillful way, that's a good thing to do. I mean, we're here practicing today because people have been transmitting and teaching Dharma for 2,500 years, right? So without our ancestors, without our Sangha friends, without our teachers, and the various causes and conditions that have supported the transmission of this practice, we wouldn't be here. So we need to have some gratitude for that. Traditionally, you earned a whole bunch of merit for copying sutras or feeding monks or underwriting something in the temple, right? Things at the local temple. These things helped keep practice alive, keep teachings available for people. So those things are important. Lotus Sutra, for instance, actively tells people to propagate it. If you're reading along in that sutra, it will say to you, please copy and spread this thing, right? So the sutra is actually talking about itself, which is a whole other interesting thing. So we have these kind of gentle reminders, if you will, that sharing the Dharma appropriately is important. On the other hand, working for the sake of the Dharma is really meaningless from the point of view of the Dharma as the reality of the universe, because the Dharma doesn't need anything from us, right? The Dharma is the Dharma. The Dharma is doing what the Dharma does. So it was here before Buddha. It's going to be here long after we're all gone. It's not going to die like ever because it is simply the universe doing what the universe does. So it kind of doesn't need our help. So what does it mean, this working for the Dharma? It's perfectly complete. It's perfectly fine just as it is. There isn't anything we can really do for its own sake. Sometimes we get worried about the condition of the Dharma when we think about Dharma as teachings. So we can think, well, the teachings are being misinterpreted or the teachings are being corrupted. Every once in a while, I'll get an email from somebody complaining about his or her Sangha saying, I think the teaching here, it's the blind leading the blind. I don't think what's being taught here is authentic. We can get worried about this or that text being misinterpreted. Sometimes when we're beginning our practice, we read a text, we don't understand it. Well, I'm afraid if I talk about this, I'm going to perpetuate some misinterpretation, right? I don't think I really know what this means. So we can be concerned about those things. You go to another Sangha, maybe they do things differently than you, and you think, well, they're not doing things right. What they're transmitting, the practice they're transmitting is not the true way, right? I have to say, in the beginning of my practice, I was one of the most guilty of really clinging to the one true way. I was looking around me and not feeling that and I was not at Sanshin at the time. I've been in a bunch of Sanghas. One Sangha I was in, I looked around and I just thought, this is not going the way it's supposed to go. Japan must be the one true way. So the really traditional Japanese practice must be the one true way. So I went to Japan and I learned all that stuff. Interestingly, as soon as I got to Japan, I realized there is no one true way, even in Japan. Boy, was I disillusioned. I was looking for, But we know Dogen kind of had the same thing because he went back to China, right? He said, I don't think this practice around me in Japan is any good. I'm going back to China to look for the one true way. So we want to do this, right? We're concerned about the state of the Dharma, the state of the teachings. It's part of the human condition. So we're really concerned about, the maintaining version of the Dharma. So Jeff was asking about the difference between Dharma as universal kind of dynamic functioning and Dharma as teachings. So let me look for a minute at what we can think of as the maintaining version of the three treasures. It's the Dharma that we encounter in sutra books and in practice and in teachings that are here today, right? So the manifesting version of the Dharma as one of the three treasures happened in the past. We can't do anything about that. Buddha taught something, to some people who lived then, that's kind of come and gone. We can't do anything about it. As we've just said, the absolute version of the Dharma will always be here. It can't get hurt. It can't die. So the maintaining version of the Dharma certainly can be misunderstood, and it certainly can be lost. And in fact, we have only to look at Facebook and all the sort of greeting card memes that are attributed to the Buddha, which completely are the opposite of what he taught. It tends to be things about building up self-concept and making me feel good about me. Completely not what the Buddha taught. And we can think, we're done. This is what people think practice is. This is what people think Buddhism is. It's all being lost. It's painful for anybody who practices to look at those things and say that's not what the Buddha taught. So this is exactly the kind of thing that the Mahayana people are afraid is going to happen during the age of Mappo, or the age of the decline of the Dharma. And maybe you've heard about this. Supposedly there will be a gradual degeneration of the Buddha's teachings in a kind of a 3-phase process. The age of the true Dharma, supposedly, was the first 500 to 1,000 years after Buddha lived, or after he taught, right? So followers were still able to practice in accordance with what he taught and the way he lived, and thereby to attain awakening. The next 1,000-year period was called the age of the semblance Dharma, right? So the practice of Dharma continues. Things look pretty good on the surface. Everyone thinks things are going all right. However, some kind of spiritual corruption has set in, and true awakening can't happen anymore. So everything looks good, but it's not, underlying it, there's some problem. The final period is a 10,000-year period. That's the age of the end of the Dharma that people are concerned about. So people in medieval China, medieval Japan, were convinced that that was the age they were actually living in. They said, Mappo is upon us, everything is declining. This is the age we're in right now. Somehow the teachings of Buddhism survive, but the actual practice has died out in some way, or is corrupted in some way. Nobody's able to attain awakening on their own anymore. It's too late. So in Dogen's time, everyone believed in this. This was a widespread, theory. This was a widely held theory. This is why Pure Land schools become popular at this time, right? Because they said that trying to attain awakening on your own efforts was not possible anymore during the age of Mappo. Instead, you have to rely on Amida Buddha to kind of reach in and save you. So that's why, chanting became popular. If you chanted certain things, or you called on Amida Buddha to save you, that was the only way you were going to get anywhere, because Mappo was here, right? So you can imagine this becomes very popular, because otherwise there's no way to be saved. There's no way to attain awakening. Now Dogen and Keizan still said traditional practice is still effective in attaining awakening or manifesting Buddha nature. They said, don't let go of this stuff. It still works. But they didn't entirely reject the idea of the age of Mappo. They didn't entirely reject the idea that there was some decline of the Dharma. So all of that is in our background in this tradition, right? So although the absolute Dharma doesn't really need our help, there's no way we can actually work for it. There is a long-standing feeling in our tradition that practice and teachings are in some danger of being corrupted or being lost. And we also have these sutras asking us to propagate them, right? We have a precept about not begrudging the Dharma. So there's work to do, right? There's some things we can do. We don't have a strong evangelical streak in our tradition. We are not about, going out and converting everybody and dragging them into a Zendo and teaching them how to sit. That, nobody tells us to do that. Nonetheless, somehow people find Buddhism. They find this practice. They come in, they want to sit. We need to help new practitioners get a good start. When we do that and we enable the practice of our Sangha, then we can say we're working for the Dharma. So if you're in the Zendo, you're in Sanshin, and someone simply comes in and says, can you point me to the bathroom? You're working for the Dharma, right? You're enabling practice in some way. You're sweeping the floor, you're making the tea. Anything you're doing in that context is working for the Dharma. But that's not the only place that happens, right? So, of course, Dogen had a lot to say about how we support the practice of our Sangha friends. He wrote about various things that had to be done in the temple. He wrote about how to be a treasurer, how to be a cook, how to be in charge of the Zendo, how to take care of the guests. He wrote about all that stuff because all of that is working for the Dharma. And of course, when we read those texts, the immediate context is you're a monk in a temple, but we have to take that into our lives, right? We're all cooking meals. We're all answering the door at home. We're all, living our lives and doing these kinds of activities. And so if we're taking care of all beings, all of this applies to us. So all of those things are working for the Dharma in that they are enabling practice in an organized Sangha in the context of what Dogen is writing. Of course, we can take a step back again and say if the Sangha is all beings, we need to take care of all beings as bodhisattvas. So anytime we're moving through the world in a skillful way, we are taking care of this Sangha of all beings, and we're working for the Dharma. So this is our day-to-day life, right? This is our moment-to-moment life. So we've seen there are several ways we can think about this English phrase working for the Dharma. In the sense of, the original for the sake of something. That for means for the sake of something, for the well-being of something. We also considered that for can be like working for a boss. The Dharma is my supervisor. The Dharma is my co-pilot, right? For can also point to what we get in exchange. So I work for a salary, right? Or I work for my room and board. So there's one way to look at that phrase is an exchange. So the boss and the salary are not things that arise in the original text in this gate, right? This is not coming out of the kanji. This is Hoko adding something from our culture and language. But I think it's an interesting way to look at this gate. So language gives us that opportunity. English just gives us another way to look about it. Think about it. So let's think about what working in exchange for the Dharma might mean. Because isn't that interesting? That's kind of what this is telling us, right? So I don't work for a paycheck, I work for the Dharma. Wow, interesting. So in other words, whenever I do work anywhere in my life, I receive teachings. That's another way to think about that phrase, right? Anytime I'm moving through my life, doing my daily activity, I'm receiving something, I'm receiving Dharma, I'm receiving teachings. Now, we can also say I'm connecting with the total dynamic functioning of the universe, right? So there's something happening here. And it's kind of not so far-fetched, right? Even though that English phrase is not the original, doesn't come out of the kanji, I think there's something that kind of fits right in there, which is interesting. It's a restatement of the teaching that everything we encounter is a Dharma gate. And we hear this all the time, right? That there's millions and millions of Dharma gates and that everything we encounter is an opportunity to practice or an opportunity to wake up, manifest Buddha nature, see clearly, right? Learn something. So if I'm paying attention, all of my moment-to-moment activity is that opportunity to understand how the universe works, right? No matter what I'm doing, I have the chance to observe what's happening in this body, what's coming up for me, what's happening here. I get to let go of my ideas about small self. When I observe what's happening here, then I get to say, okay, where's that coming from? Am I stuck someplace? Am I clinging to an idea about who I am, how this should be, right? I get to do that all the time. There's no moment when I can't be doing that. There are times it's not a good idea. I'm driving a car, I need to pay attention, right? But in our quiet moments, or when we become used to sort of monitoring a bit, like, oh, I'm feeling some suffering, I'm feeling some tightening and contraction and unhappiness and what's going on here. If we open up that little bit of space, we get to do that all the time. So there's no time where we can't be doing that. If I'm digging a hole in my yard, or I'm building a website, or whatever I'm doing, I am receiving teachings from the universe about the nature of reality and my expectations about that. This website isn't going as fast as I want. I'm digging this hole, it shouldn't take me this long. It's really hard work, whatever. I've got some expectation. Well, the reality is, I have to take earth out of the ground and it's going to take as long as it takes. So I get to receive that all the time. I live on a busy street and a lot of trash ends up in my yard. And it's really annoying because every time I go to cut the grass, I have to go pick up after all of these people. So like I come, I drive in my driveway and I look and there's just this, row of white paper and bottles and all this junk. And I just think, this shouldn't be my problem. It's really annoying that I have to pick up after these people. This is my yard, I don't want all that stuff in there. Every time I go, yesterday I went out to cut the grass. Well, first you got to pick up all of this stuff and it shouldn't be like this. My expectation is, this is my yard and it shouldn't be like this. None of this is my problem. Well, the reality is that unless I wall off my yard from the street, that trash is going to keep being there. I mean, unless I put up a physical barrier, it's still going to happen. So if I'm clinging to this idea, it shouldn't be like this, I'm setting myself up, right? If I'm getting, annoyed about doing that work, picking up that trash, it's because I have this unrealistic expectation that somehow it's going to stop overnight just because that's what I want. And I'll bet we can all point to something in our lives where we just think it shouldn't be like this. And because I have an expectation that things should be this way or that way, that's what's supposed to happen. Well, wait a minute, the universe never made a contract with me that said trash wouldn't end up in my yard. So I got to manage the expectation. When I feel that frustration in my body, I feel that contraction in my body, I get to turn that around maybe and say, it's not that I'm picking up selfish other people's trash. It's that I'm caring for my yard. I'm caring for my property. This is sort of mine to look out for and to look after. And now my job is, care for this as though I'm caring for three treasures. Interestingly, I also have a lot of large trees on my lot. They throw down a lot of stuff. Any good wind, any good rainstorm, or even just age, they throw down a lot of big branches. Well, I have to pick those up too before I cut the grass, but I notice I don't get angry at the trees for throwing all that stuff in my yard that I have to pick up. Trees are just doing what trees do. This is what happens, woodpeckers pound on those branches, or a wind comes or something and branches fall. Well, I don't like getting out there and doing it, but I'm not getting annoyed at the tree. My expectation is if I have trees, they're going to drop stuff. So, we get to turn that around. When I'm doing yard work, I have the opportunity to work for the Dharma. So I'm doing work in exchange for receiving teachings. I'm out there picking up branches and trash in exchange for the teaching that this is the way the universe works. So Dogen says all sentient and insentient beings preach the Dharma. So those teachings are there, whether I'm receiving them or not. The trash is preaching to me, whether I'm receiving that or not. So are the branches and everything else. It's not like I have a contract with the yard. I clean you up, you teach me, right? Those teachings are there. We get to take those in. They're free for the taking whenever we're ready, and we want to open our eyes and sort of take that in. So to work for the Dharma in this sense is simply to pay attention, right? It's simply to open my eyes and receive the teachings that the universe is offering while I'm moving through it and doing what I need to do. So again, to work for the Dharma is a gate of Dharma illumination, for we act in conformity with the Dharma. So now we need to look at what this means, to act in conformity with the Dharma, which sounds like a scary, rigid kind of thing. There are a lot of teachings, actually, in our tradition about being in accord with the Dharma. They center on the term Nyoho, N-Y-O-H-O, Nyoho, which you may have heard, especially from Cohen Franz when he comes and does workshops here. He's big into Nyoho. So that's an important term to know. And I could spend another hour just talking about that, but we don't have time. So traditionally, Nyoho is related to color and material and size of food, clothing, and shelter. So you could make a 9-patch kind of diagram out of that if you wanted to. The first place we usually encounter this, well, there are two places practitioners in the West typically encounter this. One is sewing rakusu. So the first time you make a rakusu or an okesa, you get to hear about Nyoho. So color, material, and size. So the color is important. It has to be a broken color. In other words, not a clear color. So it's a muddy brown. It's a bluish black. It's not a clear color. There's a whole thing in our tradition about clear colors are, not for our clothing. The size has to be right. We have to cut those pieces the right size. If it's an okesa, it has to be measured for your body. You take a measurement from your own body and so that it fits you, so that the amount of material that's going in there is appropriate. It's not too much. The material that we use is not a fancy material. Now, as soon as I say that, people point to all the brocade robes on the high-level roshis in Japan and go, what's going on there? There are times in our tradition where there's a sort of an unwritten agreement that we wink and look away. And that's one of them. And actually, black is not an okay color because it's a pure color. It's not a broken color. And we've all kind of decided we're just going to look away. I don't know why. Somebody could tell you that who knows more about it than me. The point is, we pay some attention to the color of these things, the material that goes into them. Traditionally, as you know, it was cast off material. It was rags that mice had chewed on, and they gathered up all these things and dyed them a uniform color. And that was what Buddha's Sangha wore. So even today, of course, we still cut this fabric into small pieces and sew it together. Once we've cut it up, it has no value for anybody anymore. It's not big enough to do anything else with, these little pieces, right? So in this way, we're breaking attachment. So it's important about color, size, material. The other place we often run into this is oryoki meals, or meals that are served in the temple in a kind of a formal way. So if you've ever cooked in a very traditional, for a very traditional kind of sesshin, you pay attention to color, size, and material. So color, there should be 5 colors across that meal. For ordained people, we've got 5 bowls. There should be 5, that food should be 5 colors. There's, that goes all the way back to like Indian teachings about its balanced nutrition and it's appealing. And I mean, you could spend a lot of time studying that. Size, we have to make enough, not too much. So nobody should go hungry, but we should not have barrels and barrels of food left. In our particular case in a temple, somebody has donated that food. They've either donated the money to buy the food or they've donated the food. Well, that's giving to the Dharma, and we can't throw that away, right? It's not okay to throw away somebody's offering to the Dharma. So we have to be really careful about resources. There's a reason that the Tenzo is a really high-ranking, supposedly, a really high-ranking officer in the temple because, golly, what is more immediate practice than managing the food? And I think this is one of the reasons Dogen wrote so much about this, right? Food and meals and cooking and all of that. Color, size, material. So that food should be nutritious. It should be appealing. It should not necessarily be exotic, expensive, complicated. When I was just learning to cook in this way, I was still cooking to feed my ego rather than cooking to feed practice. I was really concerned what people thought about me. I would be up until 2, 3 in the morning before sesshin started, chopping, pre-cooking, right? Because I wanted to make these complicated things. And I was really working myself into the ground. And I thought, at the same time that I knew that this really wasn't the teaching, I knew I had missed the boat, but I didn't know how. It's like I was cooking, I did every meal with a cookbook in one hand and aspirin in the other. I thought, this is not okay. But I couldn't quite figure out how to pull myself back, right? And one day I'd had enough. And I said, gosh darn it, I'm going to see what I can do to make the meal in the Zazen period before it gets served. I'm only going to give myself, and that was a place we were sitting 40-minute periods. I'm going to give myself 40 minutes. And it's going to be simple, and I'm going to see what I can do because what I'm doing is clearly not sustainable. I made simple vegetable soup. I cut up apples and cheese. I made very simple things. I sent it out there, and something really interesting happened because the responses of people was, wow, it tasted really fresh. I could actually taste the apples. I could actually taste the carrot because it wasn't covered up with all this stuff. Right? It was very simple food. So it was nutritious, it was appealing, and it was appropriate, right? So this is the kind of thing we're talking about when it comes to Nyoho. I remember once I was in a place where it was extremely hot. It was like August. And I mean, people were fainting. It was so hot and humid, it was ridiculous. We had people in full robes that really, could hardly function. And I said, I'm gonna send out a cold tofu dish. The problem is you can't serve tofu like with a spoon out of a bucket the way we go around and serve everybody in a formal meal. I said, I'm gonna have to make these things individual plates. So I made and I had 30 people or something. Individual plates with this tofu, and each one had the ginger on top and the little grated vegetables and the things around the side, and it was beautiful. And out it went, and people loved it. The problem was we had to send it out, in a separate round. Then we had to go back and pick up all those plates. Everyone loved it, but they got attached to it. They were talking about it for days. I said, okay, wait a minute. This is not Nyoho. Even though my intention was feed people something which was cold and protein and would help them, the conditions in which I did it were not appropriate because I created more work for people and I created attachment. So you see how this becomes very subtle, right? We could talk about Nyoho for a long time. Don't get me started, right? So the place we live is the third one, right? Food, clothing, shelter. So we can also think about the place where we live. Are the materials appropriate? We don't want to be living in a building which is not made with something that keeps the rain out, for instance. Is the color of it distracting? Is it appealing? Right? Is it big enough? Is it too big? I live alone. If I lived in a mansion, that would be inappropriate. If I lived in a shoebox, that might also be inappropriate, right? So what is the appropriate size for the activity that needs to happen there? Whether it's your house, it's your temple, it's your office, we can always think about these things. Are we living in accord with the Dharma? Are we paying attention? So if we do this, we are using things, making things, living with things that are not distracting and that don't induce us to form attachments. So of course those teachings apply to whatever we're doing, whatever we're making, whatever we're living with. If we're working for the Dharma by enabling practice, whether that's our practice or other people's practice, then the things we make, the things we use, conform to the Dharma. So also the way we act is in conformance with the Dharma. So we can look at that both ways. Dogen famously taught that practice and awakening are not two, right? So simply moving through the world in accordance with the Dharma is practice. So we might not be concretely enabling practice for other people. We might not be Dharma teachers. We might not be running zendos or running temples, but we are constantly enabling our own practice. We can think of ourselves as, especially now, our own Inos, our own Tenzos, our own work leaders, our own teachers in some way, right? We're kind of having to do these things for ourselves and create our own practice containers. So we need to consider what the ingredients are of creating those containers to take care of our practice for ourselves. Are we building our practice out of things and out of activities that are in accordance with the Dharma or not? So we can't do this in an intellectual way by constantly stopping to ask whether this thing or that thing is a good fit. We would make ourselves crazy. And we never get anything done, right? This is not mental gymnastics. It's not about, every time I pick up a glass or put on my shoes or do something, oh my gosh, am I in accordance with the Dharma? I mean, right? It's not practical. It's not sustainable. And it kind of makes you crazy if you're going to do that. In the beginning, it might be helpful. Maybe you make an exercise out of one day. You say, for today, I'm going to pay attention to everything and just see. But you can't do it in the long term, right? It's like in your sitting practice. You can't grab something forever and ever. So I'm not suggesting that we use that kind of a method to make sure we're in accordance with the Dharma. Little by little, though, we can put things in our lives that support our practice and that kind of keep us headed the right direction. So regular zazen, of course, is a good place to start. Get on the cushion on some kind of regular basis. Over time, we can begin to think about other things, consider other things, like how do we make a living? Is the way we make a living in accordance with the Dharma? We know on the Eightfold Path, right livelihood is important. Are we making money in a way that's in accordance with the Dharma? How about our relationships with other people, with our families, with our Sangha members, with anybody we encounter? Do those look like we would want them to look? Are we using people in ways that are inappropriate? Are we viewing self and other in ways that are inappropriate? How about those relationships? Because of course those are important and they're a big part of our lives. How about what our buying habits look like? Or what our eating habits look like? Are those in conformance with the Dharma? Do we buy more than we need? Are the things we are buying appropriate? Whatever appropriate means for you in this moment. I don't know what that means, right? How about what we eat? Are we eating things that are healthy? Are we eating things because they're comfort food? Are we eating too much? Are we eating not enough? What are those things made out of, right? We can consider this just like all the time. There's myriad ways in our moment-to-moment daily lives to just take a minute and say, Am I in accord with the Dharma? Does this make sense in my practice? Would I make a different choice if I step back for a minute? If I opened a little gap, would I make a different choice? Gradually, we can see our lives then sort of coming into conformance with Dharma. My guess is that this is what happens over time when we begin to practice. I don't live the same way I lived when I started, and probably you don't either. Maybe your practice has influenced your choices in some way because you see clearly the relationships between things, right? This is not something we need to force. Please don't force this. Sometimes people arrive in the Zendo and the first thing, they go to a service, they do some liturgy, and the next thing they're saying to me is, can I take home a chant book or can I copy the chant book so I can memorize the chants? You don't need to. It will come. It gets into your body like the Dharma and it's there. We don't need to force that. I get why people want to do it. It's fine if you want to do it, but don't force it, right? That's not what this is about. Gradually, we get to see that everything is practice, and this is our lives sort of come into alignment in that way. So it's not necessary to make sudden kind of drastic changes, and sometimes we see people do this, right? People come to the practice and suddenly they decide they're going to sit for 3 hours a day. They're only going to wear black. They're only going to eat this or that. They're going to give away all their belongings. I'm like, whoa, not necessary. For one thing, all of that's based on some idea about what practice is and what a practitioner is, right? If you're living at home with 3 kids and a job, you can't live like a monk. You can't, and nobody wants you to, right? For another thing, drastic changes are usually not sustainable. We might keep it up for a day or for a week, and then we backslide. Or we revert to the way things used to be. Then we get into an interesting cycle about, well, I clearly don't have what it takes to do this practice. I'm going to stop altogether. We fall into this with sitting, right? I'm going to sit for 3 hours a day. Well, the first day you can't do it. And then you think, well, I can't sit at all. Don't set yourself up for that, right? Gradual change is fine. Anything else is not authentic, right? Because it doesn't arise from understanding. It doesn't arise from seeing clearly. It's a performance. You think somebody's doing this, I should do this too. Emulation, imitation can be helpful, but do it in a wholesome way, right? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So when we let practice kind of seep into us over time, we can feel our lives coming into alignment with the Dharma. There are metaphors we run into in this tradition about if you walk through the mist seeps into your clothes. Or, if you're burning incense, you're making offerings to Buddha, or you're in a temple, you're burning incense, it gets into your clothes. When I come back from Japan, my clothes smell like a temple. That Dharma kind of seeps into us. Teachings and practice seep into us in that way. So working for the Dharma is conforming with the Dharma, being in alignment with the Dharma. So the most basic idea of conform is to take the form of something. So we take the form of Dharma, or we embody the Dharma. So I want to throw out a couple things about that sort of come up for me when I think about what that means. One is, even if we don't feel like we're in touch with the Dharma, when we follow the teachings, the guidelines, the quote-unquote rules, although rules is not a good word, follow the precepts, right? We're carrying out the forms when we're in the Zendo or we're going to sit. We try to remember what our vows are. Somehow then we are still moving toward the Dharma. So some days being in accord with Dharma doesn't come from my own insight, doesn't come from my own understanding. Somehow I'm not in touch with what that is. I can feel disconnected or troubled or confused. And we see this in our practice. Fortunately, we can still rely on teachings and practice to help us keep walking Buddha's way. Like one step at a time, right? We just need to do one step at a time, moment by moment. The other thing that I think of when I think about this is that when we embody the Dharma, our form is seamless with the universe. So there's no separation. We function without obstruction, without hindrance. Everything flows in a certain kind of a way. So working for the Dharma means that our actions are clear. They're directly manifesting Buddha nature somehow. There's nothing in the way. There's no hindrance. There's no muddiness that's caused by 3 poisons, right? Greed, anger, and ignorance. Those things get in the way. There's no like wacky bits sticking out somehow, tripping ourselves, that we get, we trip ourselves up or we trip other people up about that. So when we hear a word like conform, we might immediately think, well, this is telling us to fit ourselves into some kind of rigid mold that's imposed on us, and we have to follow a lot of rules and sort of, fit ourselves in. Well, ironically, conforming with the Dharma means that we're actually our most authentic, most flexible selves, right? Impermanence means that there can't be a fixed set of responses to our circumstances because everything's changing, right? So our karmic conditions are all different, and we are individuals, distinct but not separate, but we are individuals. We have certain experiences, abilities, body types, whatever. So forcing everybody into the same mold is not possible, right? It doesn't make sense. So that's not what we're here to do. If you're dancing to music, you're in accord with the music. You're responding to the music, right? If you're canoeing down the rapids, you are in accord with that river, or you better be, right? You have to have, you're in alignment with that. If you're really good at using a piece of software or a power tool or something, you're in accord with that. It feels like an extension of you. So nothing about practice, nothing about the Dharma should be forced. This is where I think we see a bit of the influence of Taoism in our practice. Zen is made up of influences from a lot of places, and I think this feels very Taoist to me. We shouldn't be forcing stuff. That's not to say that practice is not sometimes difficult or uncomfortable or a challenge. It's not always going to be easy. But that's not the same as forcing something, right? So the effort shouldn't feel like we're being unnatural, forcing ourselves into a mold. We don't force the body into this sitting posture, right? The first thing you learn when someone teaches you to sit. This is not about forcing the body into something. We don't have to force ourselves to stop thinking in Zazen. That's not even possible. If we thought that was what we were doing, we'd fail every time. None of that is in accord with Dharma. So the reality is that this human form has limitations. We have to be in accord with this, right? With this form. If we don't recognize that, then we get caught in our delusion. And then we're back to, I have some idea what practice should be or what a practitioner should be, right? Instead, what's actually coming up? How do we respond to that in a very clear way, without filters, without hindrance? So when we're working for the Dharma, we're in accord with the Dharma, not with the movie of the moment that's kind of going on in our heads, right? So working for the Dharma, working for the sake of practice, is to fit in seamlessly with what this universe is doing. So let me stop talking here because I've talked for a long time. Let me see what you all would like to say about working for the Dharma or being in conformity with the Dharma, or anything else that's bubbling for you today. What's going on for you? And remember to unmute yourself before you say something. Anyone have something to contribute this morning? I love how people always have to consider for about 30 seconds or a minute. Yes, Hennessy's got a hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what text is all of this from? The 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, if I wanted to look into this myself?
Yeah, it's actually not that easy to find, but if you go online and look up 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, it will come up. Usually somebody has just simply quoted the whole thing. They just like retyped the whole thing. So you can see all the 108 gates. If you go to the Nishijima and Cross version translation of the Shobogenzo, I don't remember what volume, probably 4, because it's right at the end. It's an appendix. Mm-hmm. You'll also find it there. You can find more than one translation, and I typically look at more than one translation, and if I'm concerned, Sagan's up and looking at his bookcase. he's gonna give us the answer. If I'm concerned about how the English has been translated, because it's like, I think there's something under this, then I go back to the kanji. Like today, I thought, working for the Dharma, I'll bet you that's not what that actually said, right? So then I'll go and look that up. Anyway, because you're a linguist, I'm going to throw that out for you. If you really can't find it, you get stuck, email me.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll send it. But you can find the whole thing online. You can read all those gates. In many ways, to me, when I read those gates, it reads like Dogen. It's like, what the hell does that mean? And then I get to investigate it. So it's sometimes I can see immediately what the teaching is, and then sometimes I really can't. So it's kind of fun. It's actually been a fun exercise. Is that enough for you?
Yeah, if I have any questions, I'll ask you later. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Other things people would like to say? Comments, questions, reflections? Jeff, was that you waving? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yeah, if you had a question, go ahead.
I didn't have a question. I just was struck by, for some reason, the teaching today seemed unusually gentle and helpful and lovely. It was, yeah.
Good. Well, sometimes I'll come and beat you with a stick.
Mhm.
Get into line. And then sometimes I'll say, what you're doing is what you're doing. So.
But it was still very powerful. I mean, I thought it was in the same spirit as always, but it just had a different quality. Thanks.
I think that's one of the interesting things about these gates, you know, in investigating each one of these things, it's really, it's a wonderful Dharma study for me. I hope it's helpful for others, but it's a wonderful study for me because it's making me investigate things in ways that I wouldn't, you know, or think about or turn over or consider things in ways that I typically wouldn't. Like I would not have connected. Usually what happens is I'll think I wouldn't have connected the first part of the gate statement with the second part of the gate statement, whatever it is, right? And sometimes out of that intersection arises something that just says, sometimes Manjushri shows up and sometimes Kanon shows up, right? Sometimes wisdom shows up and sometimes compassion shows up and sometimes, you know, both. I think that's an interesting thing about Dharma study. You know, it points us toward things that maybe we wouldn't have considered in the same way on our own. So anyway, I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah, and what you did with the word for, working for, was really wonderful. So
Homiletics is really interesting. I'm going to use a Christian term, homiletics, right? And there are, you know, usually some processes about how you do that. We don't get taught that so much in this tradition, but it's helpful for me. And because I spent years coaching presenters, I'm all about how do you write a talk and deliver a talk. And to really look at the text, you know, as an academic, you do a close reading, right? It's like, what's the position of the text within the tradition and what's the position of the phrases within the text? And if it's a translation, what does the original say? You know, and you go into all of that and what you come out with is something kind of interesting. So anyway, more than people want to know about my process. Sagan has discovered the source.
It's in volume 4 or book 4.
Yeah.
And it's on page 255.
Thank you. Okay.
It's actually in the appendix. It's not part of the chapters.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that it got stuck back there. And if I remember correctly, Nishijima and Cross has some footnotes, correct?
Just a minute.
I think they footnoted some elements in those gates. So
Yeah, they do.
if you're actually looking at that text, it will point you towards some things. It is not a commentary. You're still gonna have to do some work. But helpfully, sometimes it will say, when they talk about these 3 things, this is what they're talking about. Or when they talk about these 5 things, this is what it means.
Yeah.
So thank you for finding. So I haven't lost my mind. It was the 4th volume and it was in the appendix. You would think I look at it every week that I would know. Other things people would like to say about working for the Dharma, conforming with the Dharma. This Mark has his hand up. Both Marks have their, so Mark and then Myogen. How about that?
Yeah, I thought one of the things that was really helpful, I think, about this talk is the discussion of not really forcing the practice in some ways, just because this is one of the things, like, you know, since, you know, I started the practice, I'm much more, I notice my attachments a lot more. And then there's sometimes when you find yourself, even with open eyes, following those attachments, it's easy to kind of get frustrated with yourself, like, that's a failure of practice. But I think that talk was a little bit of a reminder to be able to have some patience with it, let it come along, and probably the fact that you're noticing it is progress in and of itself.
Absolutely. Well, you know, if this was easy, man, you get on the cushion, you know, you'd get up after an hour and say, there, I'm done. Well, of course, you know, we have to keep getting back on the cushion. Practice is a lifelong transformative kind of thing. These things are really deeply held. Right? I mean, we can look at it from a, you know, psychological point of view, but some of these attachments and cravings and aversions and delusions are really deeply held, and they kind of go with the human condition, right? I mean, if I'm craving sugar all the time, it's because my ancestors a million years ago didn't get much sugar, right? Now suddenly we're surrounded by sugar. We can eat all the sugar we want. Well, but that's, you know, that doesn't change my biology. I have to pay attention to that. So it does take time. It is water wearing away the stone. We have to have patience on the one hand. We also have to have diligence and commitment on the other hand. We can't constantly let ourselves off the hook. But when we see things, I think you're right when you say simply noticing that it's arising is job one. We went through, how many years of our lives up to this point, like never even noticing what was arising. And suddenly at least we're doing that. Amen. We need to be not, too self-congratulatory about that, but that's an important practice. That awareness is important. So it is helpful from time to time to see both sides. And on the one hand, right effort is important. When we look at the Eightfold Path, right effort is important. Commitment is important. Vow is important. Having a direction is important. And causes and conditions are also important, right? There are days we can't get on the cushion because our kids are sick. Okay, right? There are days I can't get on the treadmill because I'm running around doing Sanshin work. Okay, for today, that's my life. We do have to have a little bit of patience. We have to have some backbone, but we also have to have some patience. Yogan also wanted to jump in.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, the one thing that I found encouraging with living in accord with the Dharma, I've always said it's like when I do things, I'm not being myself. But I bow because I don't want to bow. I sit because I don't want to sit. But another way of looking, I found another way of looking at that is those are just ideas, and I'm just holding on to an idea. So, and I see that on both ways of, doing the dishes. I do the dishes, and doing the dishes, do you clean them or are you doing the Dharma? And as you're sitting there thinking about that while you're doing the dishes and think you're doing the Dharma, you're just doing an idea. If you just shut up in your head and do your dishes, you're doing your dishes, and then you're doing the Dharma. Mm-hmm. So, gathas on washing your hand, gathas on brushing your teeth. It's just washing your hands, brushing your teeth. And I've just found it's all an idea. And the helpful thing to live in accordance is drop the idea. Even dropping the idea of dropping the idea while sitting, right? The wonderful loop that gets in my head from time to time. So.
Absolutely. Well, and isn't it interesting how even when we have a good intention about something, immediately we have an idea about that. Oh, look at me. I'm washing the dishes with no intention of washing the dishes. Wait a minute. We come right back to Zazen is good for nothing. As soon as we're asking ourselves whether Zazen is good for nothing, we're not doing good for nothing Zazen. It's wow. We keep getting. We have to keep peeling that onion, right? We keep getting to step back and say, let go of that, let go of that, let go of that, let go of that. So it's like we got to sort of put ourselves on the trajectory, and then we got to let go of it, because you're absolutely right. Then we get ideas about getting ideas about getting ideas. Oh, our human condition. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Other things people would like to say. Hoshin.
I think as I've been reading these gates, I tend to attach to the phrasing of them. And the idea of working for anything, working is effort. So you're putting effort into something. But the other side of it is Dharma by itself is the creative force of the universe, is another way I think of that. So this sort of starts to follow within the precept of do not be stingy with the Dharma. And in that way, you're not tightening up on whatever your circumstances are, whatever the Dharma is trying to call forth at any particular time. There's kind of a case in point. I have a friend, he's a childhood friend, and I've been having regular conversations with him because he's stuck by himself in a tiny town, quarantining, no family, nobody around, and he's slowly drinking himself to death. So he's asking me what kinds of things can happen. And it's really hard just to be completely honest and say, you need to just try, and even if it's for one day not drink, or somehow allow your creative self just to be within your own life without some kind of awful help that's not really helping. And so I guess that's the thing that's kind of been stewing in me during this whole Dharma talk. I guess that's it. I had some other things written down here, but I always like to go to working as effort. Effort doesn't imply flow. So in a way, this is not a kind of working. And I go back to the difference between sukha and dukkha, and sukha being flow, dukkha being stuck. And I get a little more comfortable with the idea of just what the work is. When my work is good, it's not work. When I'm in my shop working away, I have a goal in mind. There's a lot that has to be done. There's no thought to it. It's just one thing after another. And all of a sudden, you're at this place. And I think that's kind of the beauty of this, thinking about this Dharma gate in this way. So I leave it at that.
I love your thinking about not begrudging the Dharma, because I mean, I mentioned it briefly, but I didn't really go there. And I really like how you're thinking about that, because as soon as we're begrudging the Dharma, we've got a hindrance, we have an obstruction, right? So to not begrudge the Dharma is in many ways to be in alignment with the Dharma. So it's not necessarily about somebody asks you to give a talk and you say yes or no. I mean, yeah, but, and there's a whole lot of, you have to be asked 3 times and all that stuff. But to not begrudge the Dharma in the biggest sense is exactly what you're talking about, right? And that's really helpful, because, how do we follow that precept? We just get out of the way. How do we not begrudge the Dharma? We get in line with the Dharma. We do things appropriately, skillfully, kind of put the self over here, as you frequently said about art, right? It's the art is kind of creating itself and you leave the room, right? So thank you for that. That's really interesting. I want to think some more about that, not begrudging the Dharma as simply being in alignment with the Dharma. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Other things people would like to say this morning? It's good to have another teacher in the room. Hannes, back to you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about something that you mentioned earlier about like the Taoist influence. I believe
knew somebody would do that.
I don't remember the exact Chinese term, and I hear that the most accurate translation is non-forceful action. Yeah, basically,
I think it's called Wu Wei.
Wu Wei.
Yeah, that's it. I was wondering, when we're trying to like work for the Dharma or whatnot, how do we, I guess, like differentiate or discriminate or whatever between like whether or not we're sort of like forcing ourselves to do something unnaturally versus just like working with the Dharma, because that seems like it's very difficult to do, especially given that a lot of times when we work with the Dharma, it's not necessarily like the easiest thing to do.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. And I don't have like a checklist, but I think the way the way Hoshin was describing, for instance, when he's in his shop and he's working, things sort of flow naturally and without obstruction. I think in the beginning, when we learn to sit and we try to take this posture, and it feels very strange because we don't sit this way in the West, and we might think, I'm forcing myself into some kind of a pretzel shape. I hope whoever is teaching you to sit is saying, please find the thing that works for your body. If that's a bench, if that's a chair, if that's a cushion, if it's half lotus, if it's Burmese, whatever, find something that works for your body. I think over time we can begin to feel what feels like there's an obstruction here that's about me that will dissolve or something over time. It's like, this feels like something which is wholesome. This feels like something which is complete. I'm a little bit, I haven't quite got it, but this feels like I'm headed the right way, versus this makes me really uncomfortable. It challenges my values. I think there's something toxic. I think there's something unwholesome. Because, even when you're in a Dharma center, there can be toxic relationships. There can be people who are doing things unskillfully. There can be power trips going on. I mean, I've seen it. I've seen it all. It's the destruction of Sangha when that happens. So I think that's not, and others, I'd be interested in others feeling as well. I think that's not an intellectual exercise. I think that's something, as a non-body person, even I'm saying, I think that's something you kind of feel in the body. I know what Hoshin means about being in the shop. If I'm out there turning a bowl, 4 hours later I come back in with a bowl, but it's like I have not, that's what the wood is doing. It's not like I can't force that wood to do something. I have to see, what does the bowl look like that's in that log, right? Like the sculptor says, I have to see, what's in the marble. It's not about me. So there's something there which I think we have to rely a bit on our own sense of wholesomeness, because something which is forced is not necessarily unwholesome, but it feels, I don't know, out of alignment, so I think when these things come up in our practice, we need to investigate. So am I feeling resistance because of my own, stuckness, craving and aversion, greed, anger, and ignorance? Am I, as Mark says, I bow when I don't feel like bowing. Okay, am I having resistance there because I don't feel like bowing, or am I having resistance because this feels like this is not a wholesome thing for me? And I think everybody's got his or her own answer to that, right? And I think we could read some Taoist stuff to maybe get down into Wu Wei a little bit, but the water's flowing around the rocks. The water's not kind of fighting with it. So it's like, how can we live without struggling against our lives? Sometimes I'll use a phrase like, I'm struggling against my life. I might be struggling in my life, but am I struggling against my life? Am I making effort to do things in a wholesome way, which is a challenge? It's not easy. It's, it's hard, but still I feel like I'm going down that river, as opposed to I'm struggling against my life. Things shouldn't be like this. My expectations are, being not being met. I'm surrounded by things that don't feel healthy for me, right? So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but some ways we can begin to think about that, because there's even the precepts. We know we have 10 precepts. We can spend our whole lives, and we do, figuring out what that means. Right? You would think, oh, here's a guideline. Here's 10 things. If we're living in this way, then everything is good, and we're in alignment. And we know those precepts have, there are myriad responses in the midst of those precepts in our lives. I think we have to rely on what's happening here, right? Do other people have things to say about that? I mean, that's just one perspective, and it's not necessarily the best or the only. What would other people like to say about that? Or anything else? It's a big topic, Hennessus. I'm sure we'll come back to it. Thanks for raising it. I'm sure it's not the last time. Okay, other things today, or shall we do our closing chant and a few announcements before we leave? Everyone good? Okay, thanks for a very good discussion. Please stay well this week. We'll finish up and do announcements. Hoshin, over to you.